library hosted that one, and I don't believe they recorded it.
Oh, okay.
Whoops. More people coming in. Okay, it looks like we're going.
I can do
Okay.
that while you chat if you like.
Hey, Pam.
All right. So can you all please mute yourselves?
It looks like we're going. I can do that while you chat if you like.
If you can let people in, that'd be great, and I will turn this off. Great. All right. Good evening. Hello. It's so nice to see everybody. We have a big crowd tonight. As of now, 107 plus extras, because I know more than one sign in on a particular address. Good evening. Most of you know who I am by now. I'm Lucy Helfrich from the 300 Committee Land Trust, and we're delighted to host tonight's Songbird Identification Workshop, which will be presented by Mike Tucker. I think, as I said, most of you have joined us on Zoom for earlier talks, but just quickly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the 300 Committee. We are so grateful to our many members and friends whose support is absolutely critical to our work to preserve and protect open spaces throughout Falmouth. Membership enables us to continue to save important land in Falmouth for conservation, recreation, farming, and clean drinking water. It helps us to manage and steward these lands and to provide outreach and educational programming. The 300 Committee has been working for, believe it or not, 36 years to permanently protect open space in all of Falmouth's villages. To date, we have preserved more than 2,500 acres, and there are always new parcels under review and lining up for possible acquisition. Our many beautiful open spaces contribute to the natural beauty and quality of life for all of us. Access to these special places is important, and I think we all realize how important during this last challenging year. If you are not a member yet, we do hope you'll consider joining us. And now a few words about our speaker, Mike Tucker, whom we are thrilled to have with us again tonight. Many of you surely know him through his local birding trips and his Facebook group, Falmouth Wildlife. An outdoor enthusiast and an avid and accomplished photographer, Mike loves to share his knowledge about the natural world and especially about birds. His passion for birds was launched at, he said probably before age 11, but he was 11 when he got his first pair of binoculars. Since then, his career and volunteer experiences have included a wide range of education and field biology work. Mike has led birdwatching trips all over the Northeast and continues to lead walks all over Falmouth. Many of us have joined him. They're great fun, and we always learn a lot. Tonight, Mike will share photos, tips, and tricks that should be really helpful to us all as we try to identify our local songbirds. This is sure to be an informative talk, and I'm sure we'll all be able to put what we learn from Mike into good use in our backyards and in many of our beautiful local protected lands. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And Mike, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. I'm glad to see such a good turnout here tonight. When doing a program like this, it can be a little overwhelming to choose, you know, the angle you're going to take, because I mean, as it is, I narrowed it down to songbirds and left out waterfowl, hawks, shorebirds, you name it, owls, and I mean, there's so many birds to talk about with identification. But the nice part is the approach I take and some of the things we're going to talk about certainly applies to all birds. That being said, as we look through this, you may or may not pick up on some tips as we go through. Something may stick with you. Nothing beats getting out in the field, and especially if you're new, getting out in the field with somebody that kind of talks about what we're seeing and those sort of things. But at least I hope you'll walk away from an approach to bird identification and just sort of some tips on just kind of how to get there step by step, and some of the things that are important with field identification. So we talked about this a little earlier. This first shot, sometimes this is the only view you get. You might just get the head, a little bit of the back, but it gives you enough clues. You have the white eye arcs above and below the eye. You have a bicolored bill, yellow throat area. You see some bluish color in the wing, and you see a bright spot on the back behind the nape. And all those add up to northern parula, or parula, if you will. I always said parula, tomato, tomato, I suppose. But anyhow, we're going to get started and talk a little bit about the different components and things to consider. You know, it's common for beginners to maybe, I don't know, if I have a question, ask, you know, I saw this bird and, you know, it had a lot of orange on the front, and that might be all they got out of it, you know, and try to train yourself to be a good observer. And hopefully the sort of things I'm going to talk about here will kind of give you ideas to consider as you're looking at these birds, the sort of things that you want to pay attention to. And as we look through the different groups of birds, there are characteristics, both physical and behavioral, that are important within those groups. Just narrow it down a little bit further. So notice as many field marks as you can. I've always said this with other ID talks, with Hawk ID or whatever. The more clues you can get, the better off you are. Try not to hang everything on one particular field mark, because that might be shared by some others. You know, so just try to get as much as you can. And just the general stuff, size and shape is really important. Even the posture, is it more prone? Is it more upright? You know, in terms of making a comparison to something you're familiar with, sparrow size, robin size, crow size, those sort of things all help to start narrowing it down a little bit. Now we're going to talk about physical characteristics a little bit here. First of all, the head's really important. The shape of the head. Not all bird head shapes are the same. You know, is the top of it seem rounded, or does it seem to have a flat crown? Does it seem somewhat blocky? And certainly with certain species like sparrows and warblers, you know, look for markings on the head, whether it's stripes, crown marks, and anything that might extend to the back of the head as well. And distinguishing features around the eyes are really important with many of the bird groups. Within certain bird groups, there are some similarities, and within those bird groups, you know, that there are subtle differences sometimes. So those can be really important when distinguishing between species. And believe it or not, eye color can come into play with a handful of species as well. And that can be very, very helpful if you notice something different there. And, you know, in terms of just narrowing it down to the group of birds it belongs to, a lot of these are important, and the bill shape is huge. Within groups, that bill shape can vary, but generally warblers, you know, have a similar bill shape, as do virios and finches and sparrows. But within those groups, there are a lot of differences, and that's where paying attention to length, shape, even color, all those things can come into play. Wings, whether it's flying or it's sitting, the shape of the wing in flight can be important, whether it's rounded or pointed. You know, I talk about wing bars and patches. You know, there are different parts of the bird that are important to look at, and it's overlooked. You know, I'll see posts on social media sometimes, you know, I saw this bird in my yard and you know, it seemed to have a lot of yellow on it and black. Well, did it have wing bars? Did it have stripes? You know, did it have yellow on the face as well? Or did it have a black head? Or, you know, all those sort of things. It's training yourself to be a good observer and making notes of some of these things that can help you narrow it down. And the underwing pattern, sometimes you can see in flight too. And that can be very diagnostic. Something like a rose-breasted grosbeak, for example, you'll see some color underneath that in flight. And some other birds as well, especially shorebirds and some other groups we're not talking about tonight. The tail, you have a lot of variation there. You know, certain groups, again, have strong similarities, but within those groups, they can be very different. You know, and sometimes they seem stubby, sometimes they seem long. And so proportions is key with a lot of these. You know, a bird can be somewhat small, but appear to have a long tail. With in actuality, it's not really a long tail because that bird is so darn tiny. Something like the blue-gray gnatcatcher, for example, proportionately it has a long tail. So those sort of proportions sometimes are worth noting. Marks on the tail, whether it has white outer tail feathers or a terminal band like the eastern kingbird on the right, whether or not it cocks up their tail like wrens do, and some other birds do that as well sometimes. So all these things come into play. Now, when you're looking at physical characteristics of bird, I'm not going to go over all of these, but I'll be talking about some of these as we go through. When I talk about wing bars, we're generally talking about the medium and greater coverts that have markings on the ends of the feathers. Sometimes those coverts are a solid color and might have like a large patch of white, for example, something like a Cape May warbler. You know, the head markings, you know, you have the crown, you have the superloral area where something like a white crowned sparrow or a Savannah sparrow has some yellow in that particular area. The auricular area, that's basically kind of like where you would imagine the ear to be, kind of behind the eye, that patch. That's important with some birds. And here they separate sides and flanks, but for most purposes, I consider anything from where that side dot is all the way down to where the flanks dot is. I just call that the flanks in general, underneath the wings to the sides of the breast and belly area. But we'll talk about some of those as we go along. But it's handy to know some of these. You know, and it's more important though to whether or not you know the name, to make observations in certain parts of these birds that can be very helpful. One of the most overlooked characteristics in terms of bird identification is behavioral characteristics. And in some cases, they can actually be diagnostic, and you know, they can certainly, you know, offer very important clues. In terms of feeding, the behavior of a bird and how it feeds can certainly help a great deal. Does it feed in the air, like a tree swallow does, flying around catching insects, on the ground, in a tree? Whoops, I'm sorry. I just meant to, I just saw a couple of space mistakes I meant to fix earlier, but that's okay. It just distracted me for a moment. But how they feed, where they feed, you know, you see terms like gleaning. That means a lot of birds will pick insects off the surface or the underside of leaves as they work in the treetops. Probing, like this black and white warbler on the left will probe the bark of tree looking for larvae and other little invertebrates. Leaf flipping, like a towhee will do. Fly catching, like a lot of warblers and of course flycatchers do, or leaving a branch, hovering, grabbing insects and going back to the branch. All those things are very important because many of these groups of birds and individual birds have very distinct behavioral clues that they give you on a routine basis. That's their thing and that's how they survive. And of course, what they eat. In other words, you're not going to see all birds go into your bird feeders and seeds. So sometimes somebody might tell me, hey, I had a yellow warbler at my sunflower feeder today. I'm like, well, are you sure? You know, you probably had a bird that had a lot of yellow on it, but they're not known to eat seeds. So what they're feeding on can be very important as well. Flight, how they fly, the cadence of their wing beat. Does it undulate in flight up and down like a woodpecker? Does it seem to be very erratic and darting all over the place? All those things can come into play. And in flight, and a lot of this really comes in handy with hawks in terms of wing posture, dihedral, decurved, flat. You know, does it seem to cup its wings down? Does it angle them back into flight? All those things, you know, everything I've talked about so far might seem a little overwhelming, but you know, you can always come back and watch this video on YouTube. But these things can be very, very important. And after a while, you start to learn the nature of groups of birds, the nature of sparrows, the nature of swallows, and those sort of things. And it's just taking a closer look at some of these birds to get a good feeling of, you know, what you're IDing. More behavioral characteristic things here. Sorry, went backwards. You know, what's the bird's preference in terms of habitat? These things are very important, but keep in mind, and I'll touch on this in a little bit, during migration, sometimes anything can go. Certainly breeding birds will always settle into the habitat, and even birds in migration will often favor their habitat, but sometimes they end up in places that they don't really belong. I mean, I photographed a magnolia warbler in a lobster pod on Monhegan Island once. I've seen black-burnian warblers feeding on the beach. You know, these are birds that you normally, black-birding, you're breaking your neck looking up. So you have a lot of atypical situations with birds in migration. But for the most part, noting habitat and where they're feeding can be also very, very important. Sometimes during breeding season, somebody might tell me they see something that just doesn't add up for the habitat. So then, you know, it's good to ask a few more questions. You might be close in terms of the family of birds, but some particular birds are very picky with their habitat. And within the habitat is a very conspicuous bird singing high up on an open branch, something like a brown thrasher might do, or a chipping sparrow might hop up high in front of, on the edge of a clearing. You know, a lot of birds are very conspicuous, and a lot are very secretive and very difficult to see no matter how hard you try. And the height, you know, and the canopy where they're at, all these things come into play. And we'll talk about a lot of that as we go through. Voice alone can identify almost every single species. There are a couple that are so close with call notes that it's difficult. It's how I identify over 90% of my birds on any given walk. You're going to hear far more than you see. And working on learning those songs can be very, very helpful. It can also feel a little overwhelming. I mean, what I did when I was a kid, I would have cassette tapes and just listen to them over and over and over again. When I was old enough to drive, I'd make sure I had a cassette player. I'm just driving around during the spring, listening to the songs over and over again. And after a while, you start to learn these things, especially when you can put 2 and 2 together and you start seeing them in their habitat, seeing them singing, and finding birds from their song. I always tell people to don't get overwhelmed and learn what's around your yard. You know, you start learning what's common around your property, and you start learning what some of the songs are. At least when you hear something new, you know you have something different, and that's a step in the right direction. Yeah, I mentioned here that they're given for a variety of reasons. Certainly territorial, advertisement, attracting mates. There's also alarm calls. You know, there's a lot of different sounds they will make, and they don't always do what they're supposed to do. And I'll talk about that as well in a moment. And now I'll talk about that now. So these are some of the things I've talked about in general, but you know, there are these little caveats, these little things to keep in mind that might not always hold true. They don't always do what they're supposed to do. They don't always look like they're supposed to look. And sometimes you have different morphs with birds, subspecies, age can make a big difference. This low bird on the lower right-hand corner is actually a summer tanager. If you look at an adult summer tanager, it looks similar, but it doesn't have wings that are that dark. It doesn't have patches of green all over it. A summer tanager is an example of a bird that has a delayed plumage maturation, and that's common with tanagers and orioles. So when you see a bird like this in the spring, it's not a bird that just fledged, but it's not an adult either. It doesn't have adult plumage. It's a bird that had fledged the previous year. The following summer, entering its second year, it will have its full breeding glory. But anyway, and even I mentioned already, habitat and feeding behavior can seem unusual with different situations. You know, a tail that is supposed to look square may look rounded from worn outer tail feathers. You know, typical flight and windy conditions, you know, might lead them to do something that they're not supposed to be doing. And not only young birds can make different sorts of songs and calls when they aren't that good at it, but every now and then you have an adult that just developed its own version of the song. Usually there's enough in there to say, well, I can still tell what it is, but it's not a typical song. So that can be confusing in the beginning when you're learning bird songs, for sure. I touched on this earlier, but it's so important. And one of the things that I did as a young kid was study my field guide. You know, what makes a sparrow, and how are they different from warblers? You know, how are swallows different from flycatchers? You know, each group has certain characteristics that hold true, and we're going to look at some of those differences within the group. But if you can nail down what group it belongs to, you are off to a flying start. You know, it's pretty common for folks not to look at the whole picture and not understand the best way to make observations. That's why it's not uncommon to see a photo posted somewhere and ask, is this a yellow warbler? When there's a goldfinch sitting on a branch. The bill of warblers and finches are drastically different. And that's where some good observation skills and learning some of those just general differences between groups can set you off in the right direction. And yeah, we'll just go on from there. because we got a lot to go through here. I'm going to start with the group of flycatchers first. Now, generally, they have large heads proportionally for their body, flat bills, think of them as tweezers. And you can really see that difference if they're moving their head around compared to something like a warbler or a sparrow. They actually remind me of tweezers with flycatchers, and they're usually very active. I can't think of one species that isn't. Some are very out in the open active, so they can put on a show like a kingbird. But they will frequently fly back and forth, grabbing insects and landing back on perches. Those are all sort of common behavioral sort of things that they'll do. When you're looking at flycatchers, now we're within a group, and you've been able to identify it as a flycatcher based on some general characteristics. What are the important things to look at to narrow down what species of flycatcher it is? Whether or not it has wing bars is very key. Like in many of these groups we're looking at, you can just eliminate a whole bunch of them just by answering that question. There are some flycatchers that pump their tail or twitch their tail. So that's important behavioral clue to note. The general shape. Within flycatchers, there are some general shape differences. It could be a peaked head that seems to have a bit of a crest on it. It could be a longer tail versus a shorter tail. And where those wings end up falling on a resting bird within the tail, they call that the primary extension. How far does that wingtip on a resting bird extend into the tail area, or does it even meet the tail when it's at rest? Those sort of things, believe it or not, start getting into a little advanced bird ID, but it can be very helpful to note those sort of things. And again, with every group, voice. You know, that they all have their own sound. They all do their own thing. And habitat is really key as well. And I'll talk about those as we look at some of these. And that's an eastern phoebe on the right-hand side there, which we will talk about right now. So these two birds are sometimes confused in the field. Generally speaking, an eastern phoebe will be either in open woodlands near clearings, maybe an open park area, or near a stream, a lake, or a river, your yard. You know, where a peewee, generally speaking, is a more wooded sort of habitat with mature trees. Their habitats can overlap for sure. You can have both of these, hearing them at the same time and maybe spinning around and seeing both from the same spot. But generally, that's a little bit of the habitat difference there. When you're looking at the eastern wood peewee, first of all, you usually hear them before you see them. They have a very high-pitched peewee, and it just kind of extends on. Sometimes it goes the other way, it goes peewer backwards, but very distinct. And they don't usually show up until the mid part of May. Certainly by the third week of May, they're in full force. I don't know of any around lately. There could be an early one ahead of the bunch, sighting here and there. But that crested head, peaked head, where it looks like it's almost agitated with its feathers lifted up, is very common. That bicolored bill is also very common with an eastern wood peewee. And they have wing bars. They might not be the most obvious or brightest, and sometimes they look even more narrow than that. There might be a little variability there. But generally, they have that sort of olive look to them. Now, what they both have that is somewhat similar is that vested look like you see on the phoebe on the right. But notice that the head is much darker on an eastern phoebe. It does not have that crest, and the face is dark as well. So that whole face and head area is very dark, and it doesn't have wing bars. Behaviorally, the eastern wood peewee does not pump its tail, and eastern phoebe does it all the time. Like it has a screw loose. It just can't help itself. It's constantly pumping its tail all the time. So that's a very good behavioral characteristic. Put in all those things together, you won't have any problem distinguishing the two. Couple of birds in the family, the subfamily of flycatchers called Tyrant Fly Catchers, which is kind of a fun name. The eastern kingbird, Tyrant Flycatcher, and the great crested flycatcher. These are both very boisterous, in-your-face kind of flycatchers, very vocal, very aggressive birds. Great crested flycatcher is a cavity nester, and they generally nest in more of a forested area, open woodlands, but a yard with a bunch of trees in it, neighborhoods, they'll be in those sort of places as well. And they do very well for artificial cavities or nest boxes. And part of the nest box program that I started months ago was making nest boxes for Great Crested Flycatcher, and I'm actually delivering one this weekend to somebody who ordered one. So they're kind of fun to have around, but a couple of key physical characteristics here. They don't pump the tail, neither of these guys do, but there's a couple of key things to look at with the tail. Great Crested Flycatcher, the color's not really showing it well here, has somewhat of a rusted, sort of rusty look to it, and you will also see that on the wings as well. And that contrasts with the olive back. And then they have that beautiful contrast of the gray face and gray throat and upper chest area that contrasts with this lemony yellow underneath it. It's a striking bird, very beautiful, very noisy. They have a very harsh single note that they do most of the time. Sometimes they'll do a little run off of that, but it's kind of a weep, very harsh and loud and ringing. And I heard one today in my yard. I heard one the other day. At BB Woods as well. So they're just starting to show up now. Eastern Kingbird is a fun bird because they're just so active. And when you see them doing their thing, you can just watch them and just get a kick out of it. When they're flying around, they'll fan that tail out. And on the end of that tail, which this picture doesn't show it well, but we saw it earlier in another slide, it has a white terminal band on the end on a very black tail. So that combination of a jet black tail with a white terminal band is very unique, and it has to be an Eastern Kingbird. Very gleaming white underneath. There'll be a little dusky area in the chest perhaps, but the chin and belly is always very white, no wing bars, very dark on the back, and a very dark head and face. The Phoebe has that dark head and face, but it just shares too many separate characteristics to really ever confuse the two. They're very noisy as well. They have a twittering sort of sound they make when they're flittering off on the treetops looking for things or out over a pond. A lot of fun. Let's talk about a few Virios here. Some of them can look similar to Warblers with their color patterns, but structurally they're different. Their bill is much sturdier and heavier with a little hook on the end. A little stockier than most Warblers. I mentioned here that they have a more horizontal posture, just so they seem to lean over a little bit more. But that's, I mean, depending on what they're doing, the situation, that's nothing you want to hang everything on, that's for sure. But generally speaking, if you watch them long enough, you will notice that they have a more horizontal posture than a Warbler does, for example. Now, with these, with this group of birds, the things we want to look at, again, wing bars are not very key with a few groups of birds. Again, the facial pattern. With Virios, that's very important. We don't have nearly as many Virios as we do Warblers, but all their facial patterns are quite different. And there are a couple where they're also very similar, and we'll talk about that as well. And the color of the plumage, whether or not it's where that tinge of yellow might be, how bright that yellow is, whether it has yellow at all, and of course the voice. And we'll start off with the Virios that have wing bars. Early in the season, starting sometimes as early as mid-April, and certainly by the end of April, we have blue-headed Virios moving through. They have a very slow song. They move around kind of slow, so it's not like a gnatcatcher or some of these other birds that hop around super active in the trees. They may hop around feeding, but they generally seem like they're more at a slower pace. Very distinctive with that bluish gray head. Beautiful, beautiful bird. And they have the white spectacles that wrap around the eye. So that white on the gray head with wing bars is key. And they always have that yellow in the flanks area. White throat is key compared to some other birds we will look at. As for example, the yellow-throated Vireo down below here. We don't see a lot of those on the Cape. It's a pretty good one to get on the Cape, but it happens. But striking bird, for whatever reason, they are much more common off Cape. I could go to Rhode Island during breeding season and find them in a lot of places, and that's almost a big deal here on the Cape. But they also have wing bars, and they have a little bit of that bluish color that contrasts with the olive back. The blue-headed Vireo has that bluish head, but the back is also similar olivey color to the yellow-throated Vireo, although the yellow-throated Vireo is brighter. But notice, though, the key difference being yellow spectacles and yellow throat. It really jumps out at you. And then the white-eyed Vireo, the white iris on an adult bird, is very, very noticeable. At first glance, the body can look you take the head off, it can look very similar to a blue-headed vireo, but the yellow spectacles and that white iris is very key. So you can see each one has their very own distinct combination of things here. You know, the yellow-throated vireo to me is pretty darn striking in that bluish wing. You usually notice in decent light. But, you know, it can be tricky looking up into the canopy of trees. That's why, again, you don't want to rely and hang everything on one, you know, field mark or behavior. You try to gather as much as you can. And then without wing bars, Philadelphia vireo, we don't really see in the spring a whole lot. It's a really, really good find if there's one that shows up in the spring, but in the fall we do. What this picture probably, well, it's probably pretty accurate. There's a lot of variability with the amount of yellow on the underside of a Philadelphia vireo, but the very key thing to talk about here is that the brightest areas of yellow are in the throat area and in the undertail area. And it's paler in the middle. Now, when you look at something like a warbling vireo, you know, the throat area is going to be very pale, and it might have a yellowish color down the flanks. So where that yellow is kind of opposite. And sometimes it doesn't really appear yellow, it's more of a buffy sort of color. The Philadelphia vireo tends to crest its head up a little bit, like you see in this photo. And the bill is probably a little smaller as well. But you can see that the head patterns are similar. So, you know, if you have a bird that isn't quite doesn't have quite the strong markings, it's kind of on that spectrum, it could be a little tricky. So you want to really look at the overall bird and try to pick up on other things, and just don't rely on head, especially if it's kind of middle of the road, isn't really jumping out at you sort of thing. The red-eyed vireo is also a barless bird, and it has that same sort of olivey back that a Philadelphia vireo has, but you notice that has the strong eye line, and that gray cap is bordered with a black line as well. So it has that supercilium of white that goes through from the supraloral area all the way over the eye into the back. But that head really contrasts with the olive back on a red-eyed vireo, and it doesn't quite contrast as much on a Philadelphia. But again, that head pattern is much different anyway. During the fall, a Philadelphia vireo, a red-eyed vireo might show a little wash of yellow that's similar to what a warbling vireo has. So, you know, that's where you just, again, the head marking will separate those two without a problem. Just to cover thrushes a little bit, I'm not going to go into too much detail on robins and bluebirds, but, you know, key characteristics, you know, the robust shape of a thrush, you know, they just seem to have a big plump breast, medium size for the most part. You know, the bill is fairly narrow. And most of them will work on invertebrates and worms and insects and those sort of things. But some of the thrushes winter over, like robins and bluebirds, and they'll take advantage of berries and some other things when they can. Key things to look at when you're identifying, it says vireos there, not thrushes. That's supposed to say thrushes. The color pattern on the back from the head through the tail. And I'll show you some examples of what I'm talking about there. Not so much a key thing with these two species we see here, but certainly with some of the other thrushes, it's very important, as is the breast spotting pattern and the eye ring size and color. That's why I threw these two up first, because most of those things I mentioned don't apply to the next set of thrushes we're going to look at. Hermit thrush and veery, both nest around here, both mostly a woodland sort of bird. The key thing with the coloration I'll start with on a hermit thrush is you have a brownish olive back contrasting with a rusty colored tail. Now with a veery, unfortunately, I need to work on getting a better photo of a veery, or at least brightening that one up. From the head all the way down to the tail, you have a rusty color. So that difference is really key with these two. If you're only seeing the back of the bird, that'll be very helpful. If you see in the front of the bird as well, or the profile like this, you'll notice the spotting in the upper breast area, and then the lower spots as they go down look like somebody took a eraser and just started smudging them out a little bit on a hermit thrush, compared to a wood thrush, which I didn't show a picture of here, which has very solid, large, bold markings, very distinct all the way through, and it's a much larger bird as well. With a veery, there's no spotting at all. It's just kind of a smudgy color of buff up in that particular area. Hermit Thrush, and this is important when we start looking at the next one, group of slides. The eye ring is there, but it's not very bold, but it has an eye ring nonetheless. And notice the face, the auricular area, the area behind the eye, that ear area, so to speak, is very similar in color to the back of the bird as well. Those are some key things to look at here. Then during the spring, we do see Swainson's thrush moving through our woodlands here, but notice that buff color in the face area compared to that sort of same sort of color on the back and the back of the head through the face of a hermit thrush. But the Swainson's thrush has a very bold eye ring, and the spotting is similar to a hermit thrush, but there's also a lot of buff that starts working into that upper chest area where a hermit thrush doesn't have that. And also the Swainson's thrush is a uniform color from the head all the way down through the tail. So it's like the upper part of a hermit thrush all the way down through the tail, where the hermit thrush has the rusty tail and the Virio has the rusty color all the way through. So you can see the differences there. Sometimes in the fall and sometimes in the spring, we get something like a gray cheek thrush. So you can see rather than that buffy color in the face, it's more of a gray wash and a very weak eye ring. A hermit thrush usually has a stronger eye ring than a gray cheek thrush. You're not going to generally mistake a hermit thrush for a gray cheek thrush. The overall color is more drab. It's not as vibrant, and of course it doesn't have that rusty tail that a hermit thrush has, but very similar pattern on the breast area. Talk about sparrows a little bit here. You know, generally speaking, they're drab and brownish looking, conical bills, usually found at or near the ground, I mentioned. This is a group of birds that I think frustrates a lot of people, but I always try to take that frustration out as best I can. And with time, you start knowing what to look for when you see sparrows. And your eyeballs automatically go and see if it has streaks or not. Does it have a central breast spot? Like this song sparrow facing us, you can see that little darker spot in the middle. There are a number of sparrows that have some form of a central breast spot. That's highly variable even within a particular species. Sometimes it's large, sometimes it's hardly noticeable, but it's something to look for anyway. And each sparrow has its own distinctive head markings. Sometimes the difference is very subtle. Sometimes it's really obvious. And you know, the ear patches I've talked about a couple of times, that area sort of behind and below the eye a little bit. There are some key things to look for there. Length of tail is huge. And again, this is proportionately speaking. You know, you see a song sparrow sitting next to a Savannah sparrow. At first glance, there can be a lot of similarities there, but a song sparrow proportionally has a much longer tail. A Savannah sparrow is a smaller sparrow anyway, a little bit more dainty looking, but proportionally its tail is still shorter nonetheless. And size. There are some sparrows, like I just mentioned, Savannah sparrow, and a few others that are on the small side. Fox sparrow, song sparrow, and some others are on the large side. Some other examples as well. So a couple to look at that I've seen confused in the wintertime when fox sparrows show up at feeders. Notice that deep, beautiful russet color. This is my favorite sparrow for sure. And you know you're a bird geek when you have a favorite sparrow. But their markings are just incredible. I love that gray sort of color that wraps around that auricular area. And that auricular area is very rusty, just like the breast spots are. And it's heavily spotted, more streaked and spotted than a song sparrow. Occasionally you see a song sparrow that seems a whole lot rustier looking in color than a fox sparrow. So it may give you pause, but if you look at a song sparrow long enough, you will notice that the head markings are quite different. That strong separate auricular patch of a fox sparrow and the strong color in the tail, a song sparrow won't really have that. And a fox sparrow is huge. It's even bigger than a song sparrow, very robust bird, but size can be tricky. So, you know, you want to get as much as you can out of these in terms of field marks. And a couple of more finely marked birds. I mentioned the Savannah sparrow on the right compared to a song sparrow. That yellow in the superloral area is also highly variable. Sometimes you see birds that have hardly any at all, and it's difficult to see in the field. This one, it shows up really well. And when it shows up really well in combination with those very daintier streaks and more sparse markings than a song sparrow, you know, you got yourself a Savannah Sparrow. Hard to tell in this photo because it's cocked down, but seeing them side by side, the tail is definitely shorter than a song sparrow with the Savannah. And then a Lincoln sparrow in some plumages can look like a swamp sparrow, can look like a white-throated sparrow sometimes at first glance. A couple of key things to look at here. They peak their head quite a bit, so notice that head shape. Keep in mind that a lot of birds can peak their feathers on their crown when they're agitated, but that's a common thing for a Lincoln sparrow to do. But that thick gray area over the eye that wraps back, and that sort of pattern that it's almost like the auricular is outlined, and that gray and buff contrast on the head is really key. But the flanks, notice how the flanks have that dull buffy color that goes down along the sides. But in the middle, it's more white where those streaks are, which you can't see from this angle a whole lot. But pencil thin markings on a Lincoln sparrow. They're a stunning bird and one of my favorites. I say that a lot about birds, but it's a beautiful one. But the Lincoln sparrow is more of a fall thing for us. So, you know, starting towards the end of September and through October is your best bet. Places like the leaf dump or a compost site here in town is a great spot to look for them. This shot I got at the Cape Cod Organic Farm, which is a great place to go bird watching. So they love these sort of pastures, community farms, those sort of places. They do really well in those situations. So here are a couple of birds that do not have streaks on the breasts, but these are two that are worth comparing to each other because both have a very boldly marked head with a combination of white and black on it. But I'll point out a couple of key differences here. Certainly the auricular area and going back to the nape of the head on a white-crowned sparrow is just this beautiful pale gray color that seems to blend right around into the chest. Notice on a white-throated sparrow, that white throat area actually has a strong line of demarcation and actually has a physical dark line that separates the white from the chest. Much brighter in the throat area than a white-crowned sparrow. And of course, the obvious supraloral area of that yellow on the white-throated sparrow really jumps out. And again, variable with those two. Sometimes white-throated sparrows are much more duller looking than that. And you know, especially the younger birds that we'll often get good flocks of in the wintertime. But when you come across a nice adult like this, they are just a stunning bird for sure. And by the way, a white-crowned sparrow is a large bird. It's really kind of approaching fox sparrow size. It's a hefty sized sparrow and beautiful song. And occasionally moving through in the spring, you might get lucky and hear one of them singing. Couple of more sparrows with unstreaked breasts. And in certain situations, I've seen people get a little confused with these two, believe it or not, although it doesn't look too tricky with these photos. But the chipping sparrow has that rusty cap, the adult bird, breeding season, unmistakable, with the pale gray breast and a very pale face with that very distinct dark line that goes through. Those combinations of things are very important. You're not going to see a chipping sparrow in the middle of the forest. You know, they like clearings, yards, neighborhoods, you know, the edges of ball fields, power line right-of-ways, gravel pits, you know, those sort of places. They like those wide open areas. And the reason why that's important is because of their song can be very similar to something like a worm-eating warbler or a pine warbler. Chipping sparrow and pine warbler habitat can certainly overlap. And when you hear that trill, I've pointed this out in some of the bird walks, you'll notice that a chipping sparrow, it sounds more mechanical, and a pine warbler, it's more fluid. And when you hear them singing side by side and you really pay attention to that, it's a good one to learn how to separate. But, you know, again, you're not going to find a chipping sparrow in the middle of the woods, and their song is probably closer to a worm-eating warbler than a pine warbler is. But a worm-eating warbler, which I don't have a photo in this, has a very specific habitat. They like rocky deciduous slopes in mature forests. You know, so sometimes they're very specific. The field sparrow, the top of the head can look brighter than that. without any streaks on the breast can sometimes prompt people to think chipping sparrow at first. But it generally has that buffier sort of breast with the white underbelly. There's usually that subtle contrast there, and that very distinct white eye ring that it's a complete eye ring where it's split on the chipping sparrow by the dark eye line. And the bill color. No matter what age, you are going to see a pink bill on a field sparrow. So that's a important distinction of these two species. Oops. Just going to go over these quickly here. Most people, can identify most of the woodpeckers we see because they're very common yard birds, but sometimes there's a little confusion with a couple of these. And every now and then we get lucky enough to see a yellow-bellied sapsucker around. Cape Cod has a few that winters over. In the fall, we get even more that move through. But that size is similar to a hairy woodpecker, the one on the right. The yellow-bellied sapsucker always has that long white mark along the wing. And that's a really key thing that the downy woodpecker does not have. Their structure and build between those two are pretty similar. The bill proportions and overall size of the bird are very close. But that red chin and red top of the head there is just a striking bird, where you just had that little bit of red on the back of a male's head on the hairy. Now, a hairy and a downy can be a little tricky sometimes. And yes, there are some subtle, distinct plumage differences that I don't focus on a whole lot as much as others do, because sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. So instead, I prefer to talk about what is obvious. And their voice, first of all. The hairy woodpecker has a very powerful series of call notes it does, much weaker with the downy. And a hairy has a stronger trill that it will let out compared to a downy. And when you hear those differences a few times, you start to really get that after a while. But look at the bill difference. That's the huge thing right there. A downy woodpecker high up in a tree with nothing else to see. So it can be difficult to gauge the size of the bird. All you really need to do is look at that bill proportion to the size of the head. If you unscrewed the bill of a hairy woodpecker and set it next to its head, it would be every bit as wide as its head. And a downy woodpecker, it's not even close to that. It's just a little nubber of a bill compared to a hairy woodpecker. And surprisingly, there is a fair number of hairy woodpeckers that nest on Cape Cod. And when I moved here 3.5 years ago, there's been a few surprises, and that was one of them. In Rhode Island, where I birded most of my life, you had to go to the western part of the state to reliably see them in the forests. And here, it doesn't even have to be a big patch of forest, and you'll have hairy woodpeckers. So they do pretty well on the Cape. I call them the tree crawlers. Here's a few species of birds we'll talk about quick. Red-breasted nuthatch is check my time here. Oh boy, I gotta get moving here. Red-breasted nuthatch and white-breasted nuthatch, very similar. They both nest on the Cape, but you can see the differences here with the head pattern and of course the reddish breast area. Both will crawl either up and down the trees. Red-breasted, again, do nest here, but this past winter they were everywhere because birds from Canada came down. It was one of those eruptive years where they just showed up in droves, and no matter where you went, there were red-breasted nuthatches this winter. It was really pretty incredible. They crawl up and down the trees, no problem at all. And then the brown creeper, taxonomically different group of birds altogether, although not that far from nuthatches. They nest around here as well. Very high-pitched song and call notes, out of the range of a lot of people. They're that high. They'll work their way up the trees, and they have that decurved bill, and they'll probe in and out of the bark. And a lot of times they're doing those high little notes as they're doing it. When they get towards the top of a crown, they won't turn around and walk down the other side. They only work up. So they'll fly down to the base of another tree and start working up. So, you're in the woods and you're backlit and you're seeing that action of a bird creeping up a tree and then going down. That sort of behavioral clue can be very important in helping narrowing it down to a creeper. Chickadees and nuthatches, I'm not really going to go over much ID stuff here because we see them at our feeders all the time, but just know that they can be very helpful when you hear them, especially in the off season when they're flocking. A lot of other birds flock with them. So if I'm going for a walk in the woods and I hear chickadees, I don't just go, oh, they're just chickadees, and keep moving. I stop and say, well, what do we have here? And I'll make some calls and I'll make some sounds to see if I could get the flock curious And quite often, there are other birds mixed in with flocks of chickadees. And the fall's a great time for that too, when warblers are moving through. I've been around Long Pond in the fall, late September, and have heard chickadees, and then went to investigate where those call notes were coming from, the flock notes, only to find a mixed flock of warblers in with them. So it's always worth noting these guys, and they're a lot of fun to have around. Both cavity nesters, both respond well to nest boxes and yards. We'll get into the warblers now. Obviously, many of them are, for the most part, bright, bold plumage patterns. Some of them are not so much, and we'll look at a couple of those. But looking at warblers, again, whether or not they have wing bars, eye rings, key tail marks, breast markings. And what I didn't put here is where that color is. So there are a lot of species of warbler that have yellow. So is that yellow just in the throat area? Does it extend into the belly? Is it completely all the way through? Or is it yellow but has white undertail coverage? So all that pattern of yellow underneath can be very helpful, and we'll see an example or two of that as well. And of course, habitat, but anything can go in migration. These are all birds with a lot of bright unmarked yellow underneath. The common yellowthroat on the bottom, easy to separate from them with a very bold face mask. If for whatever reason that was high up in the tree and all you're seeing is the yellow, then it gets a little trickier. But for the most part, they're going to stay low. Behavior-wise, they're very wren-like in behavior. They'll cock that tail up sometimes, proportionally long tail, that unmistakable black mask. And they even make little chattery sounds very similar to wrens. Prothonotary warbler is something that we don't see a whole lot of around here. There has been one over by, what's it called, Nye Pond or Nye Park in Sandwich, I believe. And I guess it's been seen for a few days there. This photo, I got lucky. Somebody found one over at Santuit Pond, and it was very cooperative. But they have a lot of that bright yellow with no wing bars, very plain head with that yellow all through the head area and the nape area. Just a beautiful, stunning bird. But the undertail coverts are white. So you see this bird up in the treetops. You see a bird with no wing bars. And sometimes that blue on a younger bird or a female on the wings isn't as obvious. And it's an unmarked yellow, bright. You might think Wilson's warbler, because that is also unmarked yellow and bright underneath. And you might not see the top of the head. You see a dark eye, but the undertail coverts on a Wilson's warbler is yellow. So it's yellow from chin to undertail all the way through, where the prothonotary has white underneath. So that's what I was talking about earlier with the distribution of that yellow, and any color really with a lot of these birds can be really important. Some streaked warblers with yellow. Cape May warbler is a beautiful migrant we get from time to time. I have been lucky enough to get them here in the spring in town, right in my yard actually around the garden. Yellow warblers breed here. They're everywhere. They love pond edges and low brushy areas, brambles, clearings, yards. They do well in a lot of different habitats. Usually they all have some sort of open area in common, a water or low wet area. And prairie warblers also do well in town, especially around the power lines and gravel pits and some of these wide open areas and conservation lands with big fields. Stunning bird. But, looking at the differences with these, this isn't a breeding plumage Cape May warbler. This is something that we might see in the fall. This photo is taken in the fall. A breeding plumage Cape May gets really unmistakable where that auricular area looks nothing like you see there. It's this deep chestnut color, the entire auricular area. Very stunning bird. And what you don't see on the wings in this shot, they actually have it's like a large white patch. Their entire greater coverts of their wings are white. So it's not just a little trailing edge. It looks like a wing patch. It looks like a wing bar. It's more of a patch. And the chestnut color on a yellow warbler, a male, is unmistakable. Sometimes a female, it's not so obvious and it's a lot more drab. But if you look close enough, you'll see that as well. But again, yellow on a plain face, like we saw with the Wilsons and prothonotary, but they have no streaks at all. And streaks just on the flanks of a prairie and a very distinct head marking. So I'm showing you photos of birds in the open where you can see everything, but keep in mind, you might just see the head of a bird poking its head out of a leaf, like that first shot to start the show. You might just see the undertail area of a bird. That's why the more you can get, the better, and the more characteristics that you pay attention to, can really single out, what kind of warbler you're looking at, and other birds as well. It's really important to try to observe as most, the most sort of field marks you can with any little glimpse that they give you. Okay, these are some birds with grayish blue color, but all very different nonetheless. The black-throated blue warbler is just a stunning little bird with that black face and blue back. That little white wing patch really jumps out at you. There are females that will look very dull and drab looking, and I probably should have put a picture of that in here, but what the female will have on that olive body, and it won't have that dramatic black face either, very olive and drab looking and drab underneath. It'll still have that white little handkerchief, they call it, on the wing. So that's an important little field mark with a black-throated blue warbler. Yellow-rumped warblers, hugely common in the wintertime here. They're not a neotropical migrant like a lot of the others, and they'll form flocks. I did a walk around Long Pond last Saturday, and I probably had, I don't know, well over 50, and that was mostly in 4 flocks, and that's probably an underestimate. And when I hear them, like the chickadees, I always stop to see what's around. I actually got some nice photos of a palm warbler because it was with a flock of yellow-rumped warblers. And there was also a northern parula, like the one on the right here, that was with a flock of yellow rumps. So when they form those feeding flocks in the spring or fall, it's always worth looking through. If you know there's a whole bunch of them that are yellow rumps, don't pass them off. Definitely scan through the flock. And the parulas are just a remarkable looking little bird. Those white eye arcs I mentioned in the beginning of the slideshow are important. That's important because some birds have a complete eye ring that goes all the way around. Some of them just have like a little makeup above and below the eye, like this one has. That bicolored bill is really key. That breast area is very variable. Sometimes it's a bright orange spot kind of smudged in the middle of that yellow. Other times it's more subtle. But that stunning color on the head and back and mantle of the bird. But what contrasts with that, if you remember back in the first slide, there was a patch of kind of greenish, olivey, bright, yellowy sort of color that's right behind the head on the back. And that really jumps out if you get the right angle. But unfortunately, you don't always get a dead eye head-on view like I got here. And I've gotten lucky with these birds from time to time. They're very active birds in the treetops. They rarely sit still, usually moving around all over the place. This one actually decided to start preening himself at eye level right on the trail for me. So I just kind of got pretty lucky with that one, but not always easy to see, but easy to hear. Very distinctive song that they have a few different variations, and they all involve a rising zippy trill, whether it's a single zip or they break it up like a zip. So they kind of give themselves away before you see them. And once the leaves come in, they're tough to get a look at. Some more behavioral things to talk about than anything else on these, because they're pretty unmistakable. With the palm warbler in the spring and sometimes in the fall, some of the birds will retain this sort of nice bright color, but you'll see some chestnut streaks, which is variable, sometimes more bold than what this one shows. And that beautiful chestnut cap with the bright yellow undertail coverts. Again, important to know whether or not there's yellow there. But that tail is a behavioral thing. They pump it constantly. They like to be fairly low for the most part. You might see them working along a hedgerow, along a stone wall, edge of a field, some low brush around a pond, even in the woodlands too. And where I found it at Long Pond the other day, it was basically in the middle of the woods because it was a migrating bird with a flock of yellow-rumped warblers. So that's a behavioral thing to look for with that. And the ovenbird, you don't always get a great look at them, but this one, I just lucked out again. I was walking around Angel Mirror Pond, which is off the southwest part of Long Pond last year. And I watched 2 of them that were just kind of chasing each other and then feeding, chasing each other and feeding. I just creeped up and sat on the ground, and it was as if I wasn't even there eventually. And a couple of times they hopped up on rocks and posed for me, and I just took advantage of it. But they have a very loud ringing voice, and they are all over town. Any patch of woods that's significant, they're going to be there. I probably had over 40 walking around Long Pond, But guess how many I saw that day walking around Long Pond? 0. They don't always show themselves that well. So I try to take advantage when they do. Fortunately, on the bird walk the other day, on Monday, we actually had a couple of looks at ovenbirds that hopped up in the open for us, and we watched it sing and everything. But they stay low to the ground except when they sing. Sometimes they'll hop up high. Behavior-wise, the black and white warbler is really what we'll talk about here because they're really unmistakable. And they do breed here in town as well, as does the ovenbird. The palm warbler, however, does not. But the black and white warbler, behavior-wise, acts very much like a nuthatch, where it'll creep up and down trees. And it will go down, it will go up. Sometimes you'll see it feeding up in treetops like other warblers, just gleaning insects off of leaves, that sort of thing. But they love hugging the tree trunks and major branches of trees. I actually watched one last year, actually this one, fly catching, which, you don't see that a whole lot. It's always fun when you can note unusual behavior. It was flying off of branches, trying to chase these mayflies or something down and then landing back on the branch. It was really interesting to watch. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get any video of that, but it was pretty neat anyway. These are two very tricky species and also difficult birds to get on the Cape. Louisiana water thrush is particularly difficult to get on the Cape because of their habitat preference, really. They like fast-moving, like rocky streams, and that's pretty much non-existent on Cape Cod. We have a few slow-moving streams. We have some somewhat swift streams that move through woodlands, but certainly no turbulent waters and rocky streams, and they just don't really happen other than catching one dropping down on a fallout in migration. Northern water thrush, I actually heard last week in South Cape Beach Park area in this freshwater wetland off the Great Flat Pond Trail or whatever. But they prefer more of a boggy sort of wetland. And the Louisiana water thrush, again, likes those fast moving woodland streams. But the difference between these two are very subtle. The chin area of a Louisiana water thrush is unspotted, and there's fine spots on a northern water thrush. The white line over the eye, or the supraloral, if you will, is and supercilium, I should say, is clean and white and usually gets wider towards the back. And it's more dull looking on a northern water thrush. But anyway, I just figured I'd throw these in here just to know that these are two very similar looking birds, but drastically different habitat. And some common ones, the pine warblers, the male and female, just to the right of it, they nest all over the Cape. They do very well. It doesn't even need to be a large patch of pines. There could be a few pines in a yard or some spruce trees, and they'll find it and they'll nest there. But that yellow breast area with a white undertail cover is important when comparing like the bird we're going to compare it to here. And mostly yellow in the face. Sometimes you'll notice a clean yellowish eye-ring on a more olive head, and sometimes that eye-ring area or split eye-ring area on a pine warbler looks more whitish as well. And I believe that's an age thing with these two. Actually, you can see the female here shows more of a white eye-ring, split eye-ring that goes around it. Now, a Nashville warbler has a complete bold white eye-ring on a gray face. So that's unique, and yellow from the chin all the way down to the undertail. So there are a couple of birds that can look similar with that bright yellow from the chin all the way to the undertail, but that very gray head with a bold white eye ring. If you can get a good angle, you can see just a hint of it here. There's a little bit of color up on that crown there, but that's not always easy to see. Usually you just see the gray face with the white eye ring. When you're looking at warblers, there are all kinds of things to ask for, and we already talked about a lot of these, and for the sense of time, I'm not going to get too much into these things because we talked a lot about these as we went along. A couple of birds in the grosbeak family that can be confused from time to time is the Indigo Bunting. Believe it or not, this stunning little bird nests in a lot of places around town, and one of the best places when I go into the compost area to grab some compost or mulch or whatever, I almost always hear them by the power line, sometimes by that parking lot to Breivogel, and then I'll even hear them down in the area when I'm loading the truck up with mulch. They love those sort of open areas, gravel pit areas, wide open yards. I've had them here in my yard from time to time, but they do a lot better than people realize. Compared it to a blue grosbeak, That bill may look pretty large on an indigo bunting, but it's even larger on a blue grosbeak. And the bird overall is larger as well. I'm talking about blue grosbeak in this talk because this one actually nests in Falmouth. And it's the only place in Massachusetts where it nests, and it nests right here in our little town. It nests at Crane Wildlife Management Area off 151. That rusty wing bar patch there is unique. The indigo bunting does not have that. Again, larger bird, heavier bill, and generally these guys are in overgrown brushy fields like the situation that's at Crane. A couple of birds that are also confused a lot, I see a lot with these two, is the purple finch and the house finch. Keep in mind that the house finch on the right can be more colorful than that one, with the reddish color extending further down into the breast and towards the belly area. But what's always present in the house finch on the right are those dark streaks, very distinct streaks, where a purple finch does not have that. It may have these buffy sort of indistinct streaks in the lower part of the belly, but the color extends much further down. There's much more color in the face, including the auricular area and the head and behind the head. And a purple finch also gets that crest. It shows that crest an awful lot. Another key thing, when you look at the house finch, the back of it, there's either zero or very, very little color in the back or the wing, and a purple finch has a lot of color there. So a decent look at the profile of either one of these birds, there's really no mistaking it with a little practice. These mimic thrushes, all three nest here. In fact, my friend Kevin told me, I don't know if Kevin's here in the talk, he said he was going to try to join. He found the brown thrasher today over at the compost site. Long tail. I really need to work on a better picture of this bird. Very beautiful rusty color all the way down through that long rusty colored tail. Striking bird. And they have a huge repertoire of songs. And the key thing I'm going to talk about here, because some of the plumage differences are just obvious, but the way they sing. A brown thrasher can imitate portions of bird songs, not really good at it, but they have a huge repertoire. And when they do it in pairs. So you'll hear de-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee, do-do-do-do-do-do. They just kind of go through these paired phrases, where a mockingbird will do 3 to 5 times. They'll just repeat it, da 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 da. Then they'll go on to the next one, do 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 do, and then to the next one. Or a brown thrasher, everything's paired with its phrases. Gray catbird, bless its little heart, just isn't good at mimicking things. You know, I love that bird. But, you know, they squawk, they squeal, they make a cat sound, you know, they do all kinds of chattering. And sometimes it could kind of sound like a vireo. That's probably the best they could pull off in terms of mimicking other things. But they are just fun birds. They are, as I'm sure a lot of you have experienced, working around your yard. They'll come in the garden while you're working in the garden, grabbing food. They can be very seemingly friendly, but just also taking advantage of what you're doing. Like when I'm mowing, they'll come in after I make a pass and grab an insect that I stirred up. Just a lot of fun birds. These two birds, rose-breasted grosbeak is showing up in migration right now. There are a few places on the Cape where they nest, but we are in an area where they will, because this part of the Cape is pretty well forested. And so both these birds stay up in the canopy, but rose-breasted grosbeak this time of year will stop at feeder trays, grabbing sunflower seed. Scarlet Tanninger might actually go to oriole feeders or feed on oranges. But the reason why I lump these two together is because generally they stay up in the treetops. Stunning as they are, unfortunately, we hardly ever get a good view of them. This one, Scarlet, was taken in Falmouth Town Forest, actually, and the rose-breasted was down in Rhode Island. But again, we do have them around here. But the key thing about their voice, a rose-breasted grosbeak sounds like a robin that took singing lessons. It's beautiful, loud, and more powerful, but similar cadence in its notes to a robin's like song you may hear towards the end of the day. A rose-breasted grosbeak, it almost has bravado. It's like quavering. Like, it's beautiful, very, very beautiful song. Now, Scarlet Tanninger also has a similar sort of cadence to a robin, but it's hoarse. It's very rough sounding. But both of these birds in the canopy can be very sluggish. So a lot of times you're just not going to see them right away, and you're going to hear them first. So learning that song is how you're going to see these spectacular looking birds. And the Baltimore Orioles are showing up. I'm wrapping this up shortly here. Sorry, it's 8:15. But again, if you had to go, I get it because it's a long talk and it will be on YouTube. But the Orchard Oriole is a bird that wasn't very common here 20 years ago. More of a brick sort of reddish orange color compared to the gleaming orange of a Baltimore. What you don't realize, unless you see them side by side, is that an Orchard Oriole is significantly smaller than a Baltimore Oriole, very noticeable, in fact. And their song is much more raspy than a Baltimore Oriole. And that's a young male Orchard Oriole down below. I talked earlier about the delayed plumage maturation, and that's another species. So that's a male that was born the previous spring. And when it comes back again the following spring, then it'll look like the one above it. These are tiny, tiny little guys. A friend of mine commented on one of my photos, said that, yes, you can mail 4 for the price of 1 stamp. They are just tiny, cute little fellas. The ruby crown kinglets, they're all about 0.21 ounces, all 3 of these, right around the same weight. But the little eye arcs in front and behind the eye on a ruby crown kinglet are important. They make a lot of chattery sounds, almost wren-like sounds. Sometimes when I first hear one, I'm like, oh, that's a wren. And I'm like, nope, that's a kinglet. They also have a beautiful drawn-out song that you'll hear this time of year that starts off with these high introductory notes and goes into this long jumble. And the golden crown kinglets will stick around in the winter here quite a bit. And you'll hear them in the wintertime with these 3 seat, seat, seat notes. And incidentally, Falmouth, again, in Falmouth Town Forest, it's the only place in eastern Massachusetts, certainly southeastern Massachusetts, where golden crown kinglet nests. They're usually kind of in more dense conifer sort of forests, but there are patches of blue spruce around Long Pond that they thought, well, this works just fine for us. And there's actually a couple different places where they nest around Long Pond. And as do the blue-gray gnatcatchers, just a fun bird with a very feisty personality, highly territorial, long tail with white outer tail feathers, very active and very vocal while they're feeding all the time. They're always making these little nasally notes. It's unmistakable once you learn them. Be nice to birds. Don't be stupid. Don't go trekking around. I'll just summarize all this. Don't break branches out of the way to take a picture of a nest. Be careful walking around the forest floor because birds also nest on the forest floor. Respect private property. There's a lot of good things there, but this is a good group here, and I have a feeling that you all practice good ethics. Some of the key books that I use, certainly the Sibley app on my phone is handy because you could do side-by-side comparisons with birds on the app, but the book is great. The National Geographic Field Guide, excellent artwork, very accurate artwork. I love the hawks in it. I love the hawks in that way better than the Peterson Guide. I know it's blasphemy, but the Peterson Guide I will never get until they figure out how to fix some of the groups of birds. The hawks, last I looked anyway, they don't even have the white scapular marks on a red-tailed hawk. The proportions are off, but the warblers and songbirds are great. And the Stokes Guide is the one photograph guide that I would recommend. There aren't many, but that one, they really do a nice job of including photos that have all the important angles and field marks to see. And in some species, they show multiple photos, so you see all the key things like gulls and those sort of things. But anyway, that's a couple of great examples there. There are a lot of good apps out there for birds. Merlin, I always liken to an all automatic camera. It's like you're not really going to learn if you're just using an app that's just naming it for you. Studying the field guide, talking about learning some of the things I talked about in this talk. That's how you're really going to learn birds. They can be good to have, but there's a lot of things you can do with a good old-fashioned studying and books and field observation. And that's all I have here. I'm going to do a shameless plug here because it's for a nonprofit and it's for a great cause. So see that email address down there? If you are so inclined, Mass Audubon is having a huge fundraiser next week called the Birdathon, and I am participating on that team for the Cape Cod sanctuaries. And if you email me and you are interested in donating for a great cause, they do so much land conservation, advocacy, education, just an all-around fantastic organization. So that's why I'm doing that for them. But I have a fundraising link. If anybody wanted to email me, I could send them the fundraising link if they wanted to add something to that little page that is created for that purpose. But anyway, that is all we have for tonight. Sorry it went a little longer, 20 past. I think we got going around 5 past. Not too bad, I suppose. I need I need some water. So, Lucy, if you want to come back in with your sound here, and we'll pull up the chats and see if we got any questions we can go over quick.
There are no questions.
No questions. Okay, I guess I covered it all.
Just lots
Well,
of thanks and congratulations and appreciative comments. And Kevin is here, so
Oh, hey, Kevin.
yeah.
Kevin,
So yeah, I mean,
good photos of that Thrasher today.
huh?
I said, I hope you got some good photos of that brown Thrasher today.
Oh, talking to Kevin.
Yes,
Yeah.
I got very good pictures of that Thrasher today. It was about
All right. Good job. I knew you would. Yeah. So anyway, I appreciate all this. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me, or if you're on Facebook, if you prefer to message me there, that's fine. I covered a lot of ground. It's difficult to choose all the birds you want to talk about here. And again, I don't expect everybody to remember every little last element, but just that sort of approach that I take to bird ID. It's good to think that way, field identification, good field skills and observation skills, and just learning some of these groups of birds and then going from there. And you'll pick up a lot if you start taking that approach. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thanks for coming, everyone. Have a nice evening. Nice
You
weekend.
too. Take care.
Thank you, Mike. Great talk.
Good night, all.
I'm trying to
Night.
figure out how to exit all these things here. I'm so confused.